Starting in the 15th century, European colonial powers like Britain, France, and Belgium plundered Africa's resources, leaving a trail of economic stagnation. Motivated by their insatiable greed and a desire to fuel their own industrial revolutions. They carved up the continent, seizing control of vast swathes of land rich in gold, diamonds, timber, and of course oil. They established brutal regimes that forced Africans to mine and extract these resources at gunpoint. This exploitation continued well into the 20th century. Take the case of Oloibiri in Nigeria. Shell's discovery of oil there in 1958 marked the beginning of Nigeria's oil industry, but it came at a heavy cost. Once a thriving fishing port, it now suffered economic and environmental misery due to oil extraction. The community, predominantly Ijaw, shifted from agriculture to oil production, benefiting Shell but impoverishing locals. Fast forward to the 1990s, and we see a similar story unfold in Ogoni. The Ogoni people, led by Ken Saro-Wiwa, bravely protested against Shell's environmental destruction. Sadly, Ken's execution, allegedly influenced by Shell, drew international condemnation but offered Ogoni little relief. The region continues to suffer from pollution, despite promises of cleanup, with little progress made. Legal attempts to hold Shell accountable have also been unsuccessful. British courts dismissed claims against Shell for oil spills in Nigeria, denying justice to affected communities. Amnesty International claims Shell mislabels spills, which are actually caused by negligence, as sabotage, further adding insult to injury. The delay in cleanup efforts exacerbates environmental degradation and social unrest. But the tide is turning. Today, we're here to talk about Dangote's oil refinery in Nigeria, a powerful symbol of Africa's rise and a step towards undoing colonial damage. For decades, European colonial powers exploited Africa's oil reserves in several hideous ways. Imposed unfair trade deals. These weren't just lopsided agreements, they were crafted under duress. Colonial powers would threaten military intervention or manipulate local leaders to secure deals that allowed them to buy African oil at a fraction of its market value. Imagine a barrel of oil worth $100 being strong-armed into selling for $20. It's worth noting that some Western media are quick to report stories about corruption in Africa, but they often don't explain how these unfair trade deals, imposed under duress, contribute to an environment ripe for corruption. By offering far less than fair value for resources, colonial powers created an incentive for corrupt practices. This exploitation fostered a system where bribery and backroom deals became a way to navigate the unequal playing field established by the West. European powers imposed exorbitant taxes on oil production in African colonies. This money funded their own infrastructure projects and benefited their economies, not the African nations where the oil was extracted. There was no say in how these taxes were spent, further deepening the economic disparity. According to sources written by Patrick Chabal and Jean-Pascal Daloz, this extractive taxation system continues to have negative consequences for African economies. Africans were subjected to brutal working conditions in oil fields. Safety protocols were non-existent, and wages were barely enough to survive. This ruthless exploitation treated human beings as expendable resources. Contrary to popular belief, the colonialists did not build infrastructure for the betterment of the country. They were only interested in extracting as much wealth from the region as possible, and they did this with ruthless efficiency. Roads and railways built during this era were designed solely to move oil from wellheads to ports for export, neglecting the needs of the local population and hindering the development of an internal trade network within Africa. Colonial powers artificially manipulated the value of African currencies in several ways. One method was to peg the African currency to the colonial powers' currency, often at an artificially high rate. This made imports from the colonial power more expensive for Africans, while making African exports cheaper for the colonial power to buy. For example, if the French franc was worth twice the value of the Congolese franc, then French goods would cost twice as much for Congolese people, and Congolese resources would be half as expensive for the French to buy. Another method was to limit the circulation of currency within African colonies. This kept wages low and made it difficult for Africans to save money or invest in their own businesses. This made African oil even cheaper for Europeans to buy, while simultaneously making it difficult for African nations to sell their own goods on the global market. It created a system where Africa remained a supplier of raw materials with limited ability to industrialize or compete. It's a vicious cycle: rich resources, crippling poverty. But visionary Africans like Aliko Dangote are breaking free from this cycle. His Dangote Refinery, the largest in Africa, is a game changer and one of many projects across the continent designed to give Africans economic independence. From investments in agriculture to manufacturing, Africa is taking charge of its own destiny. This refinery will not only meet Nigeria's fuel needs, but also pump billions back into the economy. The Dangote Refinery, with a capacity of 650,000 barrels per day, is expected to reach full capacity this or next year. This will not only meet Nigeria's fuel needs, but also limit costly imports of refined fuel, a market worth $17 billion annually. The benefits will ripple outward: more jobs, cheaper fuel, and the chance for Africa to develop its own industries, all fueled by African innovation and entrepreneurship. Dangote's refinery is just one step, but a giant leap forward towards Africa's potential to not just extract resources, but to manufacture a vast array of commodities and finished goods, from plastics and automotives to clothing and building materials. This refinery marks a turning point where Africa can finally capture more value from its own resources. The Dangote Refinery, funded by Africa's richest man, Aliko Dangote, is a powerful symbol of this shift. Europe, which once dominated Africa's oil industry, is now facing refinery closures as Africa looks inward to meet its own needs. In the last decade alone, Europe has lost over 1.5 million barrels per day of operational crude distillation capacity, and around 30 European refineries have shut down since 2009. Why? Because Africa is rising. The Dangote Refinery in Nigeria, not only the largest in Africa, but bigger than any in Europe, is a powerful symbol of this shift. This game changer will end Africa's reliance on imported fuel and pump billions back into the continent's economy. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe.